Mercantilism. What happens when economists believe that a country becomes richer by simply piling up gold? Mercantilism is born, along with losing the last two brain cells they have. This theory ran the show from the 1600s to the 1800s, and it strongly believed that a country becomes richer by exporting a lot, importing almost nothing, and hoarding precious metals. Sounds good on paper, until you realize the consequences are encouraged colonies, imposed trade restrictions, and created government-sanctioned monopolies. But the problem? It completely ignored consumer welfare and market dynamics. Nations competed in a zero-sum game, believing that one country's gain was automatically another's loss. This worldview didn't just hinder economic progress, it fueled wars and colonial exploitation on a massive scale. Today, economists universally reject mercantilism. It ranks at the bottom because it fundamentally misunderstands how wealth is created, focusing on hoarding rather than production and exchange. Laissez-faire capitalism in its pure form. Imagine an economy where the government does absolutely nothing and just hopes everything sorts itself out. Pure laissez-faire capitalism is the idea of total government non-intervention, and it played an instrumental role during industrialization, driving unlimited innovation and growth. But it completely ignores market failures, monopolies, and public goods. Unregulated markets often fail spectacularly at social protection and environmental sustainability. Without any government oversight, we see child labor, dangerous working conditions, pollution, and extreme inequality. Turns out, no rules works great for businesses, not so much for humans. The evidence is clear. Some regulation and intervention improves outcomes. Pure laissez-faire earns its low ranking not because markets are bad, but because the theory takes a good principle like market efficiency to an unworkable extreme. Communism. Here's the theory that promised perfect equality and delivered some of history's biggest economic failures. Advocated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, this theory focused on public ownership of the means of production to achieve social equality and end exploitation. The 20th century provided a harsh empirical test. Communist experiments led to widespread inefficiency, stagnation of innovation, corruption, and, in most cases, eventual collapse. The Soviet Union, Mao's China, and other centrally planned economies consistently underperformed market economies in almost every metric. That said, some elements survive and work well, such as public health systems, education infrastructure. But as a full economic model, history wasn't kind. Classical economics. Classical economists championed minimal government interference and believed markets would naturally self-correct. And honestly, they weren't wrong about those things. Free trade does create wealth. Competition does drive efficiency. Specialization does increase productivity. But they were wrong about ignoring crises and unemployment. The belief that markets always self-correct proved tragically wrong during the Great Depression. Malthusian Economics. Thomas Malthus gave us one of economics' most pessimistic predictions: that population growth would inevitably outpace resource availability, leading to catastrophic starvation and conflict. While Malthusian theory highlights real environmental constraints, it was overly pessimistic and completely failed to foresee technological advances that would dramatically increase food production. Funny enough, today's climate and sustainability debates have revived Malthusian fears, just with better data. Supply-side economics, also known as Reaganomics, or, to critics, trickle-down economics. Popularized in the 1980s, this theory argues that lowering taxes and regulations spurs production, growth, and job creation. The idea has great appeal. If you reduce barriers to business, businesses will expand, creating more jobs and wealth that benefits everyone. But the evidence? Mixed at best. Critics argue, with substantial data, that supply-side policies disproportionately benefit the wealthy and increase deficits without delivering promised growth. But to be fair, incentives do matter, just not as much as this theory hopes. Austrian economics. Austrian economics emphasizes individual decision-making, entrepreneurship, and deep skepticism of mathematical modeling. Austrian economists predicted the fall of communism, arguing that without price signals, central planners could never efficiently allocate resources. They were right. Their critique of government intervention and emphasis on spontaneous order remains influential. But here's the problem. Austrian economics is skeptical of empirical testing and mathematical models, the very tools that make modern economics rigorous. This reluctance limits its mainstream influence and practical application. Insightful, yes. Complete, no. Keynesian Economics. 1936. The world is mired in the Great Depression. Classical economics offers no solutions. Then, John Maynard Keynes published The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and economics was never the same. Keynes argued that governments must intervene to manage aggregate demand, especially during recessions. When private sector spending collapses, government spending should increase. This was revolutionary. It meant recessions weren't inevitable natural disasters, but problems that policy could address. Keynesian policies helped end the Great Depression and fueled post-war booms. Critics, particularly monetarists, highlight Keynesianism's failures during 1970s stagflation, when high inflation met high unemployment. But despite limitations, Keynesian economics remains important in modern days. Monetarism. Milton Friedman, in the mid-20th century, argued that economists, and particularly Keynesians, were overlooking something crucial: the money supply. Monetarism stresses that controlling the money supply is key to controlling inflation and promoting stable growth. Friedman's famous dictum, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." Monetarism had major influence on central bank policy from the 1970s through the 1980s. The Federal Reserve and other central banks adopted monetarist principles, successfully taming runaway inflation. However, monetarism has limitations. It struggles to explain complex business cycles and the nuances of financial markets. Neoclassical economics. The theory behind most modern economic models, brilliant on paper, questionable in real life. Neoclassical economics took classical ideas and supercharged them with mathematical rigor. It introduced rational choice, equilibrium, and utility maximization, the stuff you probably hated in Econ 101. It underpins modern microeconomics, explaining how consumers and firms make decisions, how markets reach equilibrium, and how resources get allocated. But there's a catch. Neoclassical economics makes unrealistic assumptions with perfectly rational actors, complete information, and frictionless markets. Real humans are messy, irrational, and often poorly informed. These limitations open the door for our next theory, New Growth Theory. This theory transformed how we think about economic growth. Instead of treating technological progress as external and mysterious, endogenous growth theory places innovation, technology, and knowledge creation at the center of growth. It explains why investing in education, research, and development pays enormous dividends. This theory directly informs modern development strategies and innovation policy worldwide. Schumpeterian economics. Creative destruction. The reason your favorite brands die and new ones take over. Joseph Schumpeter gave us one of capitalism's most vivid concepts: creative destruction. This theory explains how innovation constantly revolutionizes economic structures, destroying old industries while creating new ones. It perfectly captures the disruptive, messy, innovative nature of capitalism. Painful? Yes. Accurate? Also yes. Feminist economics. Here's the theory that asked a question mainstream economics avoided for centuries. What about the work that isn't paid, but keeps society alive? Feminist economics challenges traditional models by pointing out that they completely ignore unpaid labor, such as caregiving, domestic work, household management, tasks overwhelmingly performed by women. These aren't small omissions. Unpaid labor contributes trillions to global economies, yet it never shows up in GDP or productivity metrics. Feminist economists argue that real economic analysis must include social norms, power dynamics, and human well-being, not just income and market transactions. Behavioral economics. The theory that exposed the biggest flaw in economics. Humans rarely act the way textbooks say they should. Pioneered by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and economists like Richard Thaler, this field challenges the rationality assumption at the heart of neoclassical economics. Behavioral economics explains market anomalies, irrational behaviors, and systematic biases. The empirical findings are robust and have transformed policy worldwide. Governments use behavioral insights for retirement savings programs, organ donation registries, and public health campaigns. Behavioral economics doesn't replace traditional economics, it enriches it, making it more realistic and useful. Game theory. Used across economics and far beyond, game theory models strategic interactions between rational agents. It's central to understanding auctions, bargaining, oligopolies, and any situation where outcomes depend on multiple actors' choices. Developed by John von Neumann and refined by John Nash, game theory has enormous predictive power. It helps design better auctions, understand cooperation and conflict, and explain market behavior when participants anticipate each other's moves. It's not just an economic theory, it's a framework for understanding strategic human interaction. Supply and demand. When prices rise, quantity demanded falls and quantity supplied rises. When prices fall, the opposite happens. Markets tend toward equilibrium, where supply meets demand. This explains everything from flower prices on Valentine's Day to why electronics get cheaper every year. It works in markets as diverse as wheat, technology, labor, and housing. It provides the backbone of economic understanding, from the most basic transaction to complex international trade. Supply and demand isn't perfect. It doesn't explain everything, especially when markets fail or human psychology intervenes. But as a first-order explanation for how markets work, it's unmatched. I'll be making similar videos. Subscribe to watch them. What stage do you think we're in right now? Tell me in the comments.